This is Chapter 10 of the Initiate, Some Impressions of a Great Soul by Cyril Scott. And the title of this chapter is The Chagrin of Major Buckingham. It occurred to me that if there was one person alive who could help with comfort and advice my old friend Wilfred Buckingham over his domestic upheaval, that man was Morward. And accordingly, I broached the subject of his intervention to both these men, and after a little hesitation on Buckingham's part, brought them into closer friendship. The trouble was as follows. Buckingham had married somewhat early in life a woman of his own age, with whom he had lived for some 16 years in tolerable domestic happiness. In fact, everything had gone smoothly without either of the matrimonially united parties even looking at a third person, as the phrase goes, until at the dangerous age of 40, Miss Buckingham had all of a sudden developed a grand passion for an intimate friend of her husband, the complications ensuing being easy of imagination. The two lovers had carried on their amours for some months without being discovered. But things eventually proving too complex for them, Mrs. Buckingham confessed the whole matter to her husband, left his house, and took a little flat of her own, as she was not without means, so as to live an untrammeled existence, and be free to see her lover whenever she desired. As may be supposed, Buckingham himself was left to suffer a conglomeration of distressing emotions: jealousy, anger, wounded vanity, sorrow, and other less defined feelings, pulling his not over highly evolved soul in all directions at once. Like those who see others dying around them, yet forget they must die one day likewise, he had seen other people's domestic tragedies take place, but never for a moment imagined that tragedies of a like nature could even happen in connection with himself. He had never given an instant of thought as to how he should act under similar circumstances. So when the blow fell, he was like a child thrown into troublous waters and quite unable to swim. Morward it was, then, whom I brought to the rescue, and the first step he took in that direction was to encourage the Major to come to his house whenever he desired, and let off the steam of his pent-up emotions by an unreserved pouring out of all his woes into Morward's sympathetic ear, and also, when I was present, into mine. And it was to these meetings I owe my acquaintance with Morward's remarkable, and to my mind, selflessly exalted views on marriage and all pertaining thereunto. It is true, I should be very blind if I did not realize that his views may be shocking to the orthodox, for an unusual virtue, as he himself said in other words, shocks a certain type of conventional mind far more than a usual vice. But as a faithful chronicler, I cannot tone my impressions down to mere platitudes in order to please the taste of the majority. My first duty is to be true to him, and my second is to be true to myself. We used to sit of an evening at his little house, which had something of the peaceful atmosphere of a monk's cell, minus its lack of comfort, and gaze into the fire. It was autumn at the time, until late into the night, the Major from time to time walking up and down when overtaken with especial eloquence during the recital of his many woes. Morward would sit in his rather upright armchair, the tips of his long elegant fingers placed one against the other, looking, as he so often did, the very incarnation of lovingness and soul tranquillity. It seemed to me often as if the Major was a child of 6, though in reality he looked older than Morward, and Morward himself a man of 60, contemplating with love indulgence the recital of some infantile sorrow. And I must confess, after one of these outbreaks on the part of the Major, I could not help smiling. Such a point of view, as his outbreaks denoted, was beginning to strike me after some months of association with my unperturbed philosophical friend as something essentially primitive, feelings that the race ought to long ago to have outgrown. A childish sense of possession, inconsistent with human evolution. But how was this man to be converted? That was the difficulty. And then, one day, Morward embarked on the hazardous mission. The Major had talked himself out. He had reiterated for the 100th time his intentions, and had ended up saying, "Well, it is damned hard on you fellows to have to listen to this, but I tell you it does me a world of good to heave it off my chest, and I'm jolly grateful to have somebody to talk to about it. All the same, I'm going to chuck it. It's no use. One gets no further. So if you chaps have got anything to suggest, I'm quite game to think over what you have to say." "Ah, that is better," said Morward soothingly. "Our thoughts and emotions are like monkeys. Let them jump about by all means for a time, and when they begin to get tired of the jumping, then it is time to take our opportunity." The Major smiled rather bitterly. "You know full well you have all our deepest sympathy," Morward continued, "but sympathy is not everything, and is almost useless if it cannot bring any help along with it. So let us see if we can assist you somehow." "But how, in heaven's name?" the Major asked, rather peevishly. "Well, has it ever struck you that a point of view is a preventative against most troubles?" "I can't say it has," said the Major. "Well, it is, and what we want to try to do is to alter your point of view." "Well, you'll find it deuced hard," the Major observed. "But it is well worth the effort," returned Morward with earnestness. "You are a brave man, my dear Major. You act like a hero in the Boer War, where physical courage was concerned, and I think you will act like a hero in this domestic war, where moral courage is concerned." "I don't quite follow you," said the Major. "Let us go slowly, then. Has it ever occurred to you to wonder whether your wife still loves you?" "What's the use of wondering? How can she, if she goes and falls in love with another man?" "Well, that answer implies," said Morward very kindly, "that you think if Broadbent here fell in love with some woman, he would lose all affection, let us say, for me." "Bah!" said the Major curtly. "That is quite different." "Which is exactly the reply I expected," returned Morward conciliatingly. "And so, will you forget me if I put it rather crudely, but you, like many others, are hypnotized by the catchphrases of people who have not thought about the real truth of things. The difference is by no means as great as you suppose." The Major looked puzzled. "How so?" he said. "If you and your wife have lived together for 20 years, there must surely have developed an element of friendship between you?" "Oh, well, I dare say." "When you first fell in love with your wife, do you happen to remember whom it was you first told about the circumstance?" "I went along to old Wilkins. Poor old chap. He was shot near Ladysmith." Morward smiled. "Then you went to your best friend and confided in him at once, and far from losing any affection for him by falling in love, you felt you had never liked him so much in your life before?" "Well, now you draw my attention to it, I realize it was so." But supposing that friend of yours," pursued Morward, "instead of meeting your confidences with sympathy and understanding, had met them with anger, what then?" "What then? I should have sent him to the devil," came the ready answer. which is exactly what you have done to your best friend, your wife," said Morward with a conciliating smile. "Major," he continued more briskly, "you have let slip one of the greatest opportunities of your married life, but it is not too late to retrieve it." The rather slow-witted Major looked astonished, having failed to understand. "You threw away the golden opportunity of sympathizing with your wife," he explained with quiet eloquence. "Sympathizing!" shouted the Major. "Well, I'm damned!" We both laughed. "The idea is perhaps a little startling to you," said Morward soothingly, "but believe me, I earnestly mean what I say. To sympathize with your wife would be to act like the moral hero we spoke of. What is more, I can assure you it would repay you." "You mean," cried the Major excitedly, "to allow my wife to have a lover and not to turn a hair?" Thank you. And a nice ass I should look, And pray, what sort of morality would that be, I should like to know? There is a great distinction between a man allowing his wife to have a lover, said Morward gently, and condoning it when she has got one, because he knows that her passion is stronger than herself. Why, dear friend, do you condemn her for her weakness in not being able to renounce this man, yet omit to condemn your own weakness in not being able to forgive? The Major had no ready argument for this unanswerable question, so kept a confused silence. As to looking an ass, as you put it, Morward went on in the same quiet tone, I fear in the eyes of the world there is often only a hair's breadth between a fool and a hero. But in the eyes of truth, a true hero never minds being considered a fool. You see, the fool, because of his vanity, does not mind being thought a hero. But the hero, because of his lack of vanity, does not mind being thought a fool. Morward, in fact, with this last daintily put truism, had placed the Major in a dilemma from which, with merit, he could not easily emerge. So, with considerable dexterity, my tactful friend invented a most plausible pretext for abruptly changing the subject. But, my dear fellow, he said, you have come to the end of your cigar. Do let me go and get you another. I am really most remiss, allowing you to smoke that nasty stump. And he went to his cupboard and fetched the cigar boxes. After the Major had left that evening, Morward remarked to me, the finesse of virtue must always be administered in small doses. Give a man too much all at once, and he cannot assimilate it. However, we have managed to put in the thin end of the wedge. The next day I was sent on a mission to Mrs. Buckingham. I knew her pretty well, so I did not embark upon the undertaking with any great feeling of nervousness. She was not at all the sort of woman who could resent my talking quite openly on the subject with her. Indeed, she was likely to welcome the opportunity of unburdening her mind if I had read her character aright, and I did read it aright. She received me very cordially, started the subject of her own accord, and gave me an insight onto the whole matter. I was extremely grateful, being genuinely anxious to assist Morward with the adjustment of so distressing an affair. As he had inferred the previous evening, Mrs. Buckingham was still attached to her husband. But for the time being she was swept off her feet by the intensity of her feelings for this other man. I say for the time being, from my own surmises on the subject, for she never suggested a time limit to her passion. What she did say was that her love for both men was deep and lasting, but of an entirely different character. The friendship resulting from 20 years' conjugal companionship, she told me, could not die in a day, and if her husband had only made the smallest endeavor to understand her in her present conditions, things could have been very different between them. As it was, he had merely made himself an unbearable creature to live with. I even gathered that her affection for her husband was of a far higher order all along than his for her. It was both less selfish and less sensual, so that when this other passion on her part had come into existence, an entire obliteration of her affection was far from being the result. She was quite undecided as to what course to pursue, but she told me that there was one thing she would not do, and that was to live openly with her lover under the same roof. The Major, for the most part, lived in the country, and it was by no means thought so very strange for his wife to have a flat in town. As to telling her to give up this other man and make some attempt to return to her husband, well, I knew it would be useless, and so I never suggested it. She thanked me in so many words for my perspicacity in refraining. It is all very well, she said, for him to curse me and treat me as he is doing. I simply couldn't help it. I never wanted to fall in love with Basil, but the thing was plus forte que moi. Just a moment. The thing was plus fort que moi. And there's the end of it. She also went on to say that she hated being regarded as an enemy and was really longing to be friends with her husband once more. This, then, was the content of my interview, the content of my interview with Mrs. Buckingham, and on my informing Morward of the fact, he telephoned to the Major and invited him to dine a few evenings later. After the Major had been apprised by me, for I was invited also, of all that had taken place between his wife and myself, and after he had been afforded an opportunity, as usual, of giving vent to his conflicting emotions, Morward embarked upon a further stage of his education in supermorality. "You see, my dear Major," he said, "your wife still loves you, as I predicted, and her affection must be really deep and true if she can fall in love with another and still love you. As I said the other night, if you remember, perhaps you have been led by a process of hypnosis, so to speak, to believe that one love kills another. That it untrue, the criterion of real love is that it lasts beyond the birth of a new passion." The Major thought this all very clever, but found it difficult to be convinced of its truth. "You have your wife's own remarks to bear it out," insisted Morward quietly. How do I know she isn't lying?" suggested the Major shortly. "First of all," I interposed, "it is pretty easy to detect when people aren't telling the truth, and secondly, I fail to see what object she would have." The Major shrugged his shoulders. "You may be right," he said doubtfully. "Come, my friend," began Morward afresh and in a very persuasive tone, "let us try and look at this thing from both a heroic and a practical point of view. To begin with, your deep distress over the matter implies that you certainly do not wish to lose your wife. Further, you wish to avoid a scandal. You have told us also that this man has had many affairs before, and that sooner or later he is likely to leave her in a lurch. Thus, in addition to these other things, you wish to save her." "Well, I don't think she deserves it," muttered the Major bad-humoredly. Morward smilingly ignored the remark and proceeded. "Above all, you wish to recover her love. Well, there is only one thing to do, and that is to take her back, show her sympathy, affection, and understanding, and then bide your time." "You surely can't expect me to do that," exclaimed the Major. "In your case, my friend, I should certainly feel inclined to. There is really nothing else to be done unless you wish to lose your wife forever, to lose her love likewise, to create a scandal, and to ruin her, since you refuse to divorce her, you say." The Major gazed moodily into the fire. "I suppose you really did love your wife?" asked Morward quietly after a pause. The Major assented. "Has it ever struck you that love always thinks of the happiness of the beloved? And if that happiness comes even through another man's arms, true love doesn't mind." "I'm not a saint," said the Major shortly. "But why not be one?" "It's too infernally difficult." "Well, not if you can find the right point of view." The Major was silent. His brain utterly failed to take in such heights of morality. He could rather see it as immorality. Extremes are often so alike in appearance that he could only just perceive the faintest glimmer of a difference. And so Morward left it at that for the time being, and renewed the subject on the next occasion we were all three together. But on that occasion he let his persuasive eloquence have full sway, and finally he gained his goal. "What, after all, is marriage?" he began with, after a few preliminaries, "and what does it become? The ordinary man starts matrimony with a mixture of romantic sentiment and physical passion. The sentiment by degrees dies away, and the passion dies away also, dwindling into an occasional gratification of the senses. And in the place of these two things comes either friendship or utter indifference. If the latter, then, for a man to be upset when his wife falls in love with somebody else seems unreasonable. If the former, then, for him to be upset seems equally unreasonable, true friendship being greatly enhanced when it can act as the receiver of confidences. You yourself admitted you were never so fond of your friend, I mean the one who died near Ladysmith, as when you were able to confide in him your own romantic passion. What does that mean? Why, that if you had sympathized with your wife over this new love of hers and let her fearlessly confide in you, she on her side would never have felt so fond of you as during that exchange of confidence and sympathy. I thought for the first time that Buckingham was beginning to see a small glimmer of light, although he said but little. And it would be so, Morward continued eloquently, because she, all the time, would sense the nobility of your unexpressed forgiveness, and therefore not only be grateful, but full of admiration as well. Indeed, nothing augments affection so much as gratitude and admiration combined. And therefore, I cannot think I was wrong when the other night I told you you had let slip the great opportunity of your married life. The Major drummed his fingers meditatively and kept a partially consenting silence as he gazed into space. For, continued Morward again, where there is true affection, no opportunity is so golden as to the one which affords us something to forgive, since to forgive is at the same time to manifest nobility of character, and thus to show ourselves nobler before the object of our love. Yet, as one form of forgiveness may need to express itself in words, the greatest of any is that which is so self-evident it requires no words to express it at all, its presence being rendered all the more conspicuous by its very absence. Nay, real love forgives its object always, even before there would seem something to forgive, and all true friends love each other the better, the one for having some fault to pardon, and the other for being pardoned respecting that fault. Once more the Major was silent. And so, my friend, is it not obvious what is the most heroic and practical thing for you to do? Take your wife back again, and bide your time, and show her by pointing out that hitherto you have not acted as nobly as you might have done, that she, too, on her part, has something to forgive, for she will think you far the nobler, as you will be, for confessing to be at fault as well, and the result will be that both of you can enjoy the felicity of forgiving the other. The Major looked doubtful. You are not altogether convinced? Morward queried, smiling. Yet surely, although not to forgive is a form of childishness, there can be a little doubt that to forgive is not only the best policy, but also a true joy. You are asking me to do a great deal more than to merely forgive, said the Major at last. To take her back, knowing all the time she is carrying on with another man? Hang it all, that is a bit more than I can stand. But why? Asked Morward quietly. Why? Because, well, doesn't she belong to me? Exclaimed the Major. And then, once again, Morward let the flow of his eloquence have full sway. My friend, he said, the seat of nearly all trouble is the sense of possession or the feeling of mine and me. And in your own case, this undoubtedly applies, as it applies in too many other cases as well. For in your heart you say to yourself, she is my wife, and yet fail to make the wisdom-fraught distinction that, although she be your wife, she herself, soul and body, is not completely and undeniably yours, and therefore to desire that she should be so, since a person's soul belongs to himself or herself only, and to nobody besides, is in reality as futile as the desire to exercise ownership over the sun or the moon, while to grieve because this may not be so is to waste one's grief on the desert air, and one's activity of mind and emotion as well. And even if you think to discard the soul and care only for ownership over the body, your predicament is scarcely the less, for since you cannot enclose your wife in a prison, spying on her and her actions from morning till night, she is at liberty to do with her body whatever she likes. And should you exact from her more than she can fulfill, she will only deceive you in consequence, and more wrong will be added to the sum of her actions. Besides, after all, for what is your grief when you trouble to try and regard its real cause? For truly is the exchange of a kiss here and there worthy of so much distress, and is the mere And is the merely physical, which has gained so much importance in the eyes of the world, really not infinitely less than the love of the soul and the affection which hardly cares for the physical at all? Surely the eyes of the world are blinded when they would repay one fault by a fault far greater, and make one sin an excuse for a far greater sin in return. And just because you have the world to encourage you in a lapse of nobility, permitting you to cast your wife away on account of a little passion, which sooner or later, by reason of the transience of all passion, must fade of its own accord. Are you really going to succumb and thus lose the great because of the little? Truly the action were not the action of a hero, and that being so, you will take the nobler course instead. Here Morward paused, whilst the Major looked at him with a certain sort of wonder and admiration. "May I ask one thing?" he said. "Did you carry out all these amazing ideas on your own wife?" "Well, yes, I did," replied Morward with modesty. "Do you mean to say that the same sort of thing happened to you?" asked the Major excitedly. "Pretty much the same," Morward assented. "And you never told us about it?" "I never regard my own affairs as especially interesting to others." But we both declared we could not let him off, and so we sat far into the night listening to the one episode I have ever been able to extract from Morward vitally concerning himself. My only regret is that I cannot reproduce his intimate style, which had, as he himself, a touch of poetry and melodiousness of language fascinating to any listener.